Probably.
This is Rachel Woodcock. I'm interviewing Edwin J. Alston on March 14th, 2010. How old were you at the start of World War II?
At the start of World War II, I was 11 years old.
What did you know about the war before the Americans became involved?
Most of my parents kept thinking that we would not become involved in the war. We were all reading the news and hoping that it would not happen. But we also would see ships sinking off the North Carolina coast when we would go to the beach on vacation. So we knew that there was a danger of it happening, but I think all of us hoped that it would not.
Do you believe that America was really neutral before it officially joined the war?
I did then, but I don't now.
What kind of information were you given about the war as it was happening, and where did it come from?
The only news we really received were radio broadcasts and newspaper articles. Of course, there was no TV. My dad was a ham radio operator, so we got some news from overseas through him talking to his buddies on the radio. But as far as the news we got, I'm sure that it was highly tailored to be propaganda to make us feel good and not to let us know just how badly things were going at the beginning of the war.
So earlier you said something about the ship sinking off the North Carolina coast. What was that about?
Well, although we were not at war, we were sending supplies to other countries that were fighting in the war. And those ships were sailing up and down the North Carolina coast. There were German submarines, we were later told, just off the coast, and they were sinking these supply ships quite often. If you were on the beach, you could not see the explosions or anything. You could often see the smoke from them as they were burning. And then later you would find material washed up on the beach that had come from the ships that were sunk. So we knew something was going on, and yet again we were thinking, okay, we won't be involved in that. But for a young kid, which I guess at that time I was around 12 or 13 years old, that was quite exciting. It was hard to think of it as being at war when, as kids we all played games of war and cowboys and Indians and all these kind of things. So it was kind of like a game, even though it certainly wasn't a game when we came to find out what had really happened and how many people had been killed. I also spoke about my dad being a ham radio operator. During the World War II, all ham radio operators, those are amateur radio operators who had their own radios in their home, they had their own call sign, they were expected to join something that was called Mars. During the war, the ham radio operators were really one of the best contacts we had for getting information around the country, because we couldn't use the military network itself, and there really wasn't any other way of doing it. So the ham operators might get a call from somebody in another country wanting to pass a message on to their father up in Pennsylvania, and the ham radio operators would then relay the message to someone who was nearer to them until it eventually got to the person. They were called MARS, which stood for Military Air, I forgot what it was, Army Rescue Service or Amateur Radio, that's what it was, Military Amateur Radio Service. And you used them a lot because they could use what was called Morse code. And Morse code could be heard almost anywhere in the world, where voice communication was very short range. You could not get signals by voice, say, overseas, but you could through Morse code. So they recruited all these ham radio operators, and my dad had his shop right there in the house. So many times I'd be out there with him as he was communicating with other things. They also assisted some in rescue of, got a message that a boat was in trouble out in the Atlantic, the person getting that might be one of the amateur radio operators, and they would pass the word on to some military command, usually Coast Guard. It was a very useful group, and they performed a lot of good services. They were civilians, not part of the military, but they did have a military-type activity.
What did you know or hear about blitzkrieg warfare?
Okay, it was very scary. In fact, they showed some of it. There was something called news flashes that they would show in the movie theaters. They were put out by Paramount News. And those news flashes were, I'm sure that, again, thinking back, they were pure propaganda to try to bulk up our spirits. But one of the things they would show was actions overseas. And the blitzkrieg was a German tactic that, as the best of my understanding was, that they used everything that they had when they wanted to attack one particular spot. They would use tanks, airplanes, dive bombers, everything, soldiers, ships if they were close to the ocean, and they would put a full-scale attack on a place and just literally destroy it. And it became known as the blitzkrieg, and this is what they did all through Europe. They went from one place to another, just destroying things as they went and taking them over. That was the understanding we had of what blitzkrieg was. It could have been that there was another, but that was my understanding.
Were you aware of the Japanese internment camps?
Yes, but it was played to us in a much different light than eventually we found out it was. We were told that we were in danger of the Japanese, especially on the West Coast, allying with the Japanese attackers and setting up and destroying, sabotaging things on the West Coast. But as it turned out, it was very unlikely that any of those families who were in prison were actually threats to us. But we didn't know that at that time, and the people did take it out on people of Oriental descent. A lot of times they wouldn't even be Japanese. They might be Chinese or from one of the islands out near there, but to Americans who, when they'd see them, they were Japanese, and we were not very kind to them. At times, literally, I think some of them I don't know that, but some of them we were heard were even killed. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. But we were aware, but we were very much made aware of it by our government, justifying why they locked all these people up and took them away from their homes.
When did you find out that they weren't actually a threat?
I'd say we really didn't find out till after the war, and in fact maybe even many years later. They certainly weren't going to admit it at that time. So as history went on, time went on and history looked back, it was found that no, they didn't really pose any threat. But you have to remember that here we were being attacked, and we were attacked by the Japanese, and that therefore anything that looked like it might assist the Japanese was seen as a threat. And so as far as the government was concerned, it was the right thing to do to lock them up.
Did you have any personal experiences with poor treatment towards Asians?
Only minor. In Wilson, North Carolina, where we live, I remember that there were two shops there. Whether they were run by Japanese or run by Chinese, I don't know. But I know that in both cases, those shops they weren't destroyed or attacked. People just quit using them. They wouldn't take their clothes there to be cleaned, or if one of them was a tailor shop, they wouldn't take their clothes there to be altered by the tailor. They just avoided them and therefore were punishing them in that way.
Did you feel that most Americans were sheltered from the actual status of the war?
Do you mean by that, were we told the whole truth about what was happening?
Yeah, and like who was winning and...
I'm sure we were. I'm sure they did not tell us things till things started really turning our way. They did not tell us just how bad things were. We were losing islands. We were losing everything we had out in the Pacific was being destroyed. But the propaganda part of it said, well, we won this battle. We sank these ships. But in reality, we were losing all the way through until the latter part of 1942 when things did improve and we started winning a few things. But no, we weren't told just how bad things were. No, we were told how many people were being killed.
Were children aware of the war?
It depends on what you describe as children. I was, as a teenager, 11-year-old going into my teens, yes, I was very much aware of it. There was always a threat that if it had lasted 1 year longer, I would have been drafted and gone into it. So that always was there. My mother worried about it for that very same reason. She had this vision that maybe the war was going to go on for years, and therefore her only son, which was me, would be drafted and have to go into the Army. Whether the little small children, certainly grade school children were aware of it. And if you want to, I can describe a little bit about what the grade children did. It might not be the time that you wanted in your interview, but it was interesting what they had us doing.
Okay.
Okay, I attended a school called Margaret Hearn School in Wilson, North Carolina, from the 1st through the 5th or 6th, I think it's 5th grade. That was during the period of time when the war was really firing up, getting bad for the United States. We were out of everything. We couldn't get metal, which had come from other countries. We couldn't get rubber, which came from the islands out in the Pacific. We couldn't get the food that had been grown in those places. We couldn't get things that we were normally used to having because the places that made them had been converted into manufacturing equipment that was needed for the war. Well, one of the things they did was they were very much in need of scrap metal. So they started this group, and they called us soldiers, and we had officers' ranks and this type of thing, and our job was to find all of the scrap metal that we could and bring it to the school. It was weighed, and based upon how much you brought in, you received a rank. You might start out as a private and work up to a sergeant, and a lieutenant, and even to a general if you got enough of it. And the object was to raise as much metal as they could to give to the plants that were manufacturing things, where they might melt them down, mostly for the metal in them. But it was something that got us definitely involved. I remember that I think either came in first or second in the poundage that was collected at our school. And the way my buddy and I did it, we went, the county dump was maybe a mile away, and we would go down there every afternoon and dig through the garbage, pulling out things like water tanks and old tires and springs, anything that could be used, and we put it onto wagons and pull it back up to the school the next morning. So they had us all involved. They especially had us saving money to buy what they call war bonds, which were used to finance the war. They had us volunteering to not use anything that we didn't have to use. And so the kids were involved. They were made very much aware of the fact that there was a war going on. Now, if you got down to the real small kids, now I doubt if they knew, unless they had a father who had to go off into service. Then they were aware, and there were a lot of them around that did that were called into service and had families.
What age could you be drafted?
18 was the normal age, but a lot of them went in at 17. Mostly the draft boards didn't really question if you said you were 18 years old. They let you go in. I think they would probably let you go if you were younger than that, but the official registration age was 18 years old.
How did the war affect the economy?
Well, as I said earlier, you couldn't get hardly anything. You got 2 pairs of shoes a year, I remember that. You got 5 pounds of sugar every month. Now, that's a real thing. We use 5 pounds of sugar probably every 4 or 5 days, or maybe certainly one a week for the whole family. But that was it. You got a limited thing. You could get meat, like beef or something like that. You could only have it for one night a week. You were expected to grow whatever you could in the form of vegetables and things like that to help support your family. That got to where they were rationing everything. When you got what they call ration stamps. would get one stamp that would allow you to buy that one pair of shoes a year, or maybe it was two, but anyway, you had a stamp to buy them. You had stamps for buying sugar, you had stamps for buying meat, you had stamps for nearly everything, and the store had to have that stamp from you or they couldn't sell it to you. So it was kind of tight. It was never, you wouldn't say we were starving, certainly not. I know my family raised chickens, so we had a lot of chicken. We had chickens. Now, we were in the middle of town. Today's town, they probably wouldn't let us raise chickens like that. We had, I guess about 20 hens and one big old mean rooster, and we had plenty of eggs, and we had plenty of chicken meat to eat because we kept hatching chicken, those smaller chickens, and raising them. But that was one of the ways that we were able to help our family. But ration stamps, that's a subject in itself. It was a tight time. You couldn't buy things. People did cheat. People would get ration stamps that counterfeited and use them. That goes on no matter what kind of the world, part of the world we live in and whatever time we're in. Some people are going to cheat, but there was rationing, and we were very much limited as to what we could get.
Were the ration stamps, like, did they have, like, the name of the family?
Not a name, they just had a thing. Like I said, you'd have a stamp that said good for 5 pounds of sugar.
So,
a stamp that said good for a pair of pants, a pair of shoes, or one tire for your car. Oh, gas was rationed. Then you had to have stamps to get any gas for your car, and it was very much limited to people who needed a car to drive to work. There was no pleasure driving. They stopped making cars here in the United States for people. They were using all the factories to make tanks and other vehicles that the service people needed. So from about 1941 until 1946, you could not buy a new car in the United States. A regular person could not. So it was, if your car broke down, you tried to get it repaired. If you didn't get it repaired, you rode a bicycle. If you didn't have a bicycle, you walked. I rode a bicycle to school because they didn't have enough gas to run the school buses all the time. Sometimes they run, sometimes they do.
Was it hard to find jobs?
No. The reason it wasn't hard to find jobs, of course, I wasn't impacted with that. I did have jobs all the way through from the time I was 13 years old until I went off to college. But the reason it was not that difficult to find a job was because almost all the able-bodied men were in service, and that meant the women, if you think women are doing jobs now, back in those days the women took over many of the jobs that the men had done. They became factory workers, they helped grow the crops, they worked from the farms. The farms were very vital to our country, but most of the men had been taken into service. So no, it wasn't difficult to find a job. They didn't pay much. If you got $1 an hour, you were at the top of the ladder as far as pay was concerned. I was working for 25 cents an hour, so you can see times change as far as for how much, but things didn't cost that much either. So the money went much further what you had than it would today.
Where were you when you heard about the Pearl Harbor bombing?
I was on the back porch at our house at 408 Gold Street in Wilson, North Carolina. I was playing a game with one of my best friends, Bobby Lewis. We were out there, and I had a radio at that time, and the radio was on. My parents and Bobby's parents were inside the house, and we heard it come through as a news flash on that little radio and ran into the house. We didn't really know what it meant. We just know somebody was beating up on the United States. And we ran in and told our parents, and they came out and listened. And of course, they were very sad-faced about the whole thing because they realized what that was going to mean. And of course, what they thought was going to happen did.
How old were you then?
How was I then? I was 11 and a half.
And did it scare you, or did you not really realize what it meant?
I don't think it scared me. I probably didn't realize what it meant. It sounded exciting because it sounded like something that was a game, whereas of course it was not a game.
Did you think that most people agreed with the president's decision to go to war?
Well, had he done it before Pearl Harbor, the answer would have been no. They wanted to stay neutral. They did not want to become involved in it because I think all of them recognized what was going to happen. But before the war even started, we were drafting people like crazy, building up our supplies, doing all the things that were needed to be ready, but of course we weren't ready. We were nowhere near ready to fight a war. And so the people, after they were attacked, it was not difficult to get people to be supportive of it. It's just like recently, when they bombed the World Trade buildings. There was no problem in getting people fired up to go attack whoever it was that attacked us. And it was the same way then. We knew specifically that it was the Japanese, and so all Japanese really became enemies. And of course, at the same time, so did the Germans, because we declared war on both of them at the same time.
What was the overall atmosphere after the news of D-Day was told?
Joy, expectations of good times returning, the hope that nobody else was going to be killed, that families would be coming home, that they could start to live normal lives without a fear of someone being killed during the war. And also the expectation was that happy days were here again, that we were going to have lots of jobs, houses, food, all the things that we had done without for 4 or 5 years. They were going to suddenly become a part of our lives again.
Did your knowledge of the German concentration camps change your feelings towards Germans as you grew up?
That was another one of those things that you never knew what to believe. We really didn't know till near the end of the war what was going on. We knew they were transporting the Jewish people and others off, but we really didn't have the knowledge that they were killing them in these death camps until near the end of the war, and we began to find them and find all the thousands and thousands of people who had been killed. So I guess the opinion was during the war, we weren't really sure. We didn't know what was happening completely, although we were told that the Jewish people were being led off, but we really weren't told how badly it was that they were all being killed.
Do you think that after the news spread about what actually happened, did most people believe it?
Most people, yes. Most people did. I think you couldn't hardly look at the films that were taken by the soldiers when they would free these death camps, when they go in there and you'd see these pictures of these people who are just walking skeletons, and all the bodies laying around, and all the shoes in a pile, and all the false teeth laying in one place where they had taken them. All these things that you saw, you could not anymore not think that it happened. So yes, I think people did believe it as soon as those kind of things started becoming available to us.
Did you know anyone who served in World War II?
Did what?
Did you know anyone who served in it?
Oh, many.
Like anyone in your family or close to you?
I don't remember anyone in my family, immediate family, serving. No, I don't think we did. There were many that were drafted after the World War II, and in fact, I went into service during the Korean War, so there were a lot of us that missed World War II just due to our age. But I knew lots of people in Wilson who were drafted or who went into service on their own, and there was very little. People just did it. It wasn't like you forced them to almost. People were willing to go into service. They were willing to fight for their country. You didn't see anybody trying to. I don't even remember a draft dodger during World War II. I'm sure there were some. I just don't remember any. So the people then went into the war. They did what they had to do, knowing that some of them would be killed, but they still did it. And it was, I think, the thoughts about supporting your country back then, maybe it was just because it was driven into us, you could call it brainwashing, whatever you want to, but the thoughts of the people were, you did whatever you could and you gave up whatever you had to in order to hold our freedom and to win the war. So, yes, there were a lot of people went in. I didn't have anybody in my immediate family that did.
Do you think that after the war they still felt like it was a good cause, or did they feel like regret it? Or
I'd say overall they felt like it was a good cause. It's been different than the wars since then. There have been very few, and if you won't hear many today, that's saying we should not have fought that war. It was one of those things that was forced upon us. We had to do something, or we would have lost. Maybe Hitler wouldn't have invaded the United States. He may have just taken all of Europe and cut us off completely from that part of the world. But it was obvious that if we didn't want things like that to happen, that we had to go ahead. And I think the people, even today, those who were living during that time, are very supportive of what we did.
In school, did you have to read like books, or were you taught by your teachers like propaganda type things? Like,
I suspect we were, but we probably didn't recognize it. The reason I say I suspect we were, that the news articles themselves were highly set up in such a way to keep our morale up, and so the schools used those, and we got to see those little news flashes that were always meant to build up our morale and to make us feel better and to make us feel like we were going to win. So, yeah, I think some of the things we were told were not completely accurate.
did the war effort, did that provide jobs for anyone in your family as far as like factories that were making supplies for the war?
Well, my dad worked for the Western Union. It was deemed to be, he was a manager of the office in Wilson, North Carolina. That particular job was deemed to be a critical skill because the Western Union, whether most people would know it now, the Western Union was the one that delivered the messages for things like when people were killed, or soldiers were killed, or when they were injured, or when they were missing, or when they became prisoners of war, that the War Department would send a telegram to the family. That telegram would come through the Western Union, and so the Western Union was responsible for delivering everything. Just as a side note, I worked as a messenger boy for the Western Union from, I guess it was about 1943 to 46, somewhere along in there, and I probably delivered maybe at least a dozen, maybe more than that, death messages to the families. They would always send the policeman along with you when you were delivering it, because you never knew what the reaction of the family was going to be if you walked up and gave them the message. And as soon as they saw the message, they knew. I mean, that was, when you got a telegram, you knew that something bad had happened. So it was, I only got threatened one time, but there was a policeman with me, and so he was able to take care of it. But it was just something that had to be done. It was another service. So my dad worked there, and so he was not in any danger of not having a job. As I say, I think he got paid, I don't know, $75 or $1 an hour. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us going. My mother worked for Merrill Lynch and Company, which was a brokerage house. That was, they couldn't pay her a lot of times because they didn't have the money, but she was given shares of stock, some of which ended up being worthless, but some of them turned out to be pretty good. So overall, it wasn't bad, and both of them had jobs, which left me, even as a 11, 12, 13 years old, pretty much by myself as far as after school and weekends and this type of thing. So in this day and time, that wouldn't be good, but in that day and time, it's pretty much expected that anybody would work.
So your mom worked with the stock market. Was the stock market doing well at that time?
It was so, the price of stocks was so low then that we'd consider it a catastrophe if it was that way today. But they survived, and there were people that made money investing in stocks. It never went under. The stock market continued throughout the war. And in those days, they had what they called ticker tapes. So the ticker tape would come into the office like we see on TV now with the prices running across on the screen. Well, the ticker tape would come in the office, and somebody, in some cases my mother, would take the ticker tape and run over to this big chalkboard, and they would write the current price of each stock. Like if it, I don't know, yeah, they had IBM then. Say it was IBM, they'd run over and they'd put up IBM on the board and write what it was selling for at that time. And of course it was much slower, and the volume of traffic purchasing of stocks was almost non-existent if you compare it to today's world. But yes, the stock market continued. Prices stayed reasonably well for that time. People did make money off of it.
What do you mean you got threatened when you delivered the message?
I delivered one message to a house and just got on my bicycle and rode away very fast because I was scared. I said, basically, and it was near dark, and it was in a neighborhood that I didn't like being in, even if I hadn't been delivering messages. So I rode away real fast and got about a block from the place when I sensed that there were two other bicycles closing in on me from behind, and they were yelling at me. And of course, as I said, we had a policeman along. He didn't go up to the house with us, but he intercepted the two bicycles, and the two on the bicycles were threatening me because I had delivered a message about, I think it must have been their brother who was killed. So that was not unusual. People who delivered messages ran into that quite often.
Do you remember your parents' reaction to the war?
Well, it's hard to know whether I remember. I know what I sensed, but I don't know that I really knew how they felt. Mother was very much concerned for me, mostly because she thought I was probably going to have to go into service. Dad was very concerned because he didn't know how he was going to support his family, and how was he going to send me to school. I was very near college age when this war ended. So he was concerned financially, and my mother was concerned about me. And I think both of them were concerned that they'd not lose the things that they had bought over the years. They were very fortunate. They had some income during the whole war.
So your mom was concerned about you being drafted, but then how old were you when you went to the...
I was 21 when I joined the Navy during the Korean War. Actually 20, but turning in my 21st year. So, yeah, that was a decision. My buddy and I decided that we'd rather go in the Navy than to be drafted and go into the Army, because the Army was being sent to North Korea at the time, or South Korea, and ending up in North Korea. And we just decided it would be a little bit better to be in the Navy than it would to be in the Army and fighting on land in the Korean section.
Why do you think it'd be better?
Because I never had anybody shoot at me. I did not have to take combat training. I stayed in relatively nice locations. It was just the security of being in the Navy, as far as your health and welfare, was much better than that being in the Army and being in the infantry or any part of the Army that was fighting.
During the war, would you say that most Americans, like, overall, were more fearful or inspired, like, fired up about it?
Depend on the news. I think we were fired up. In the beginning of the war, I think we were very fearful that we were about to be invaded. The West Coast was treated as an area that very easily could have been invaded. If it wasn't, Japanese even figured out how to drop bombs out of balloons on the West Coast. They never did much damage, but it sure did scare a lot of people. And the thing would fly over, and when it landed, it would explode. So, yeah, they were afraid then. As the war progressed and we could see that we were we were winning it, then we became more aggressive than we were afraid. In other words, we just wanted to do something, beat up on them, I guess that's the right word.
Would you say that after the war, the veterans and people who fought in it were treated with respect and honor, or did they come home and like didn't have jobs and weren't taken care of?
That was a real difference. They were treated with more respect than the veterans in the later wars, like the Korean and the Vietnam, and even in the Iraq War today. They were treated with more respect. They were welcomed home. They were given college educations. They were provided with cheap housing. The job market was wide open because all of these things that people hadn't bought for years and years, now the plants could go back to manufacturing them and people could buy them. So there were jobs, there were plenty of jobs right after the war. Housing, government and other companies just furnished housing that was affordable. The people could buy it. And a lot of that housing still remains today. Okay. Just as a recollection that at the end of the war, especially at the end of the war in Europe, I think the end of the war in Japan was a little more subdued just simply because of why it again came so quickly there, because of the A-bombs that we dropped. That although we celebrated at the end of the war with Japan, the end of the war against Germany was much more of a celebration type thing. In Wilson, where we lived, when the announcements were made that the war was over, I remember that the car horns, what there were of them, were all blowing. The sirens were going off at the fire stations, and the what fireworks they had were being shot, even though it was in the daytime. They were still shooting them off, and everybody was just celebrating. Downtown Wilson really became not a very big town, but people just went there, I think, just to be where other people were and to be around and just to be able to kind of feel good about what had happened and not to be just sitting home by yourself celebrating. We went where other people were. The kids especially. I remember then, I think I was 16 at that time, but I remember going down there and standing on the steps at the courthouse, and actually we were throwing water balloons, which isn't very good, but we had some old balloons that we had at the house, and we filled them up, and it was fun. Everybody didn't mind getting wet. Everybody was just celebrating, and it was a fun time, and we certainly glad to have it happen. But like I said, we didn't have that same kind of celebration at the end of the war against Japan because of the fact that we knew that hundreds of thousands of people had been killed with the A-bombs, and it was a little more subdued. Even though we all felt that it needed to be done, it was still not as much of a celebration as the one where the end of the war with Germany occurred.
So there was no negative feelings towards the bombing in Japan?
I can't answer. I know that from the people I knew, there was at that time there was no negative feeling, because we knew that if we had to invade Japan, that we could lose 500,000 deaths. It's just that kind of a thing. They were going to defend that country to the very end. They were not going to give up. And so to beat them, you were going to have to just defeat every single one of them, be it soldiers or civilians or whatever. So the end of the war, in that sense, by the A-bombs, I think was very much appreciated. Later years, I think there may have been some regrets about how many were killed, but I don't think there were any regrets about ending the war.
So, that seemed to be necessary, that was the way to do it?
Well, none of us knew about it ahead of time. There was no way of knowing that we possessed any weapon that could do that kind of damage.
Did you know that other countries had those kinds of weapons?
They did. None of the other countries did have it. That was the thing. We were the first and the only one at that time. Now, since then, yeah, other countries have them now. But at that time, we were the only one. The Germans had been working on it, but they were never able to successfully complete it in time to use it. And many of the scientists that developed ours were actually scientists that had been rescued from Germany and came here to work on the bond.